What's the worst thing you have ever done to an annoying neighbor? When I was really young, our neighbor Druggy demanded we move our septic tank because he claimed it was partially on his property. He was a complete jerk about it and kept at it. My dad's a really laid back person. Eventually even he got mad and had the property line surveyed. Turns out not only was the septic tank on our property, not his, but the corner of his house and part of his driveway was actually on our land. Dad spent the next few months asking him when he was going to move his house off our land. My mom's neighbor called the city to demand they make my mom repair her fence that divided their yards. This lady has always been a crabapple for 10 plus years, but this move pissed my mom off. The fence did need a few mild repairs, which my mom would have done if the neighbor had just come talk to her. She was already in the process of getting quotes. The city contacts my mom and says you have to maintain your fence. My mom asks if she legally has to have a fence and the person she talked to could sense where this was going. Turns out there are rules about maintaining a fence, but not requiring you have one. So my mom pays a contractor to tear it down entirely. The neighbor does come to talk to my mom and asks when the new fence will be built. My mom says you want a fence, build it yourself. Couple weeks later my mom has a nice new fence, courtesy of one annoying neighbor. A little petty, perhaps, but hilarious nonetheless. We lived in a neighborhood of townhouses. One neighbor let their dogs shit all over everyone's lawn and never picked it up. We tried asking them. We tried picking it up and putting it on their doorstep. They refused to do it. My one neighbor decided to get a piece of it and smear it all over the front of the house. After that, they started picking it up. Similar story happened where I live. There was a really quiet meek guy and the neighbor would constantly let their dog poo on his front lawn. He tried all the normal things like pepper on the lawn, motion sprinklers, little signs, etc. The dog owner didn't care and continued letting his dog poo on the man's lawn. Then one day, the man was pushed too far. The next part of the story came from a decorator I know who lives in the same close. What happened was the guy got so mad he mashed up and liquidized his own poo and made a watery enough substance that he put into a super soaker. He followed the man home and then returned in the middle of the night and emptied it through the man's litter box. The impact splatter hit the walls, hallway, stairs and ceiling and even reached into the kitchen at the end of the hallway. Apparently the stench was horrendous. I had a terrible work schedule and had to wake up at 2:30 am to be at work by 4 am. My downstairs neighbors would blare loud music at all hours of the night, and I could feel the bass through my mattress. I went downstairs and politely asked them to turn down the music, and they seemed to kindly agree. As soon as I got back in bed, they turned it up even louder and kept it going until about 1:30 am. Before I left for work at 3:30, I turned over my amplifier so that the speaker was facing the floor, turned the volume up, and set my guitar on top of it. I left for my 12-hour shift, and the feedback was still screaming. When I came home, neighbors never blared their music again. Here to say that this exact situation has happened to me, and that is also exactly how I dealt with it. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. People don't always respond well to kindness. I had a noisy neighbor in the apartment above me. When I went upstairs to address it, the music was so loud in the hallway that I couldn't tell which unit it was coming from. I finally did, knocked on his door and politely asked him to turn it down. He refused. I told him that I have a right to live in my space without hearing his noise. He informed me that he paid the same rent as me and had a right to play music. I knew I wouldn't get anywhere with him. After a few more days of this, I decided to take action. Each floor had a laundry room. The one on my floor had all of the electrical panels for individual units clearly labeled. Every time he blasted his music, I would go to the laundry room and turn his power off. I started off with a few seconds to give the illusion that he blew something, but when he still wouldn't put his music lower, I would just shut his power off for hours. I could hear him swearing, but I didn't care. My lease was almost up, and as soon as it was, I was out of there. Even complaining to property management does nothing. They just want the income and could care less about terrible occupants. I had a barracks roommate I used to do similar with. She had this habit of leaving her TV or music on and leaving loud enough I could understand what was being said. One time she was gone for a week. About 3 days in it occurred to me we had a brake box in our common area. It got to the point that if I didn't see her car in the parking lot, I would just flip the breaker. Trying to talk to her about things never went anywhere. There was someone at the barracks I lived in who turned his speakers up so loud and faced them out the window so everyone had to hear it. Base police didn't give a shit, so after a few hours one of the women in the barracks knocked on his door and finally got him to open the door after some flirting. There were 3 guys against the wall and they forced their way in and took his entire stereo system and threw it down the trash chute 5 floors. This one's not my story, but my great-grandfather's. My great-grandfather was one of the last people in town to get indoor plumbing, and as such, had an outhouse in his backyard. Every year on Halloween, neighborhood kids would come into the yard and knock over the building and expose the cesspit. He got tired of it. So one year, the night before Halloween, he moved the building forward, then covered the fence with burlap, disguising it in leaves and grass clippings. In the dark, it was almost impossible to tell it was there. Halloween night, he sat in the outhouse and waited. It wasn't long after sundown when he heard the wet splat outside as a couple of kids fell into the muck. He lowered a ladder into the cesspit for them to leave after making them promise to never mess with his outhouse again. The kids honored their promise and even spread the word around the neighborhood not to mess with that outhouse anymore. My grandmother had a neighbor over her back fence who refused to help her repair the fence between their properties. It was still functional as a boundary line, but it was falling apart. Any conversation about fixing the fence ended with him saying that it was on her property, so it was her fence, and therefore she was fully responsible, which was fair. She took a fall and was hospitalized for a few weeks. Upon her return, she found a new fence built an extra 5 feet into her property and a bill in the mail from the neighbor. He argued with her for months that she owed him, that the original fence was on his property and that where it was now was the boundary line. My grandmother got a severe surprise. The original fence was correct and the neighbor had taken 5 feet of her yard. At this point she was very old, frail, and tired of fighting her asshole neighbor. Instead, she let nature take over. She planted blackberries along the back fence, and within 2 years it was covered. Every year, she'd walk the fence and throw seeds over because of course, it was still her yard. After 5 years of fighting, the blackberries had reclaimed her property. She's been gone for a few years now, but the blackberries remain. Her way of haunting her neighbor. He's tried ripping up the ones on his side of the fence on numerous occasions, but the plants reseed themselves and grow back every year from her side. Had a neighbor in my apartment complex that kept letting her huge dog take huge shits in my yard space. Literally got to about 20 huge dog shits sitting outside my window, and I had enough. Put on a glove and picked up all the shit and dumped it on her doorstep. Left a note stabbed into the ground telling her to pick up her dog shit. She started picking up the shit and moved pretty soon after, lol. Edit. Funny addition to this story is that it was actually 2 dogs and 2 women. They lived together, looked similar and had 2 big golden doodles. So they were both letting their dogs shit in front of my apartment for weeks. That explains why it was such a large amount of shit. I have a similar story. When I was a kid, we had a neighbor who didn't get along with my mom. She would, I assume, on purpose, let her dog shit in our front yard. My mom was fed up with this and took a garden shovel to scoop it up. She went over to the neighbor's house and launched it at her house where it splat all over her windows. No more dog shit in the front yard after that. Best to not mess with my mom. Not me, but my grandpa. My grandpa's neighbor's septic tank started leaking into my grandpa's backyard. He repeatedly asked his neighbor to fix the septic tank and clean up the mess in his yard. The neighbor completely brushed him off. So my grandpa took matters into his own hands. He rigged up a plumbing system in his yard. He installed an upright PVC pipe that pointed at the neighbor's backyard over the fence. I don't know how the system worked. I was only about 8 years old in the early 90s. But it was set up to spray the neighbor's own septic waste over the fence and into the neighbor's beautiful and polished yard. And just like that, the neighbor fixed his septic tank. They remained enemies until my grandpa died a couple of decades later. I miss that old crazy bastard. I was visiting my aunt a couple years ago in Arizona. She lives outside of Phoenix. Their next door neighbors had 3 or 4 kids who were super annoying. There was a brick wall dividing their backyards, as is common for the area. Upon my arrival I find out that the kids next door throw things over the wall for fun. Not just like harmless twigs and pebbles, but like rocks and toys and garbage and even knives. My aunt's family had to keep their trampoline on the other side of the yard so it wouldn't get crap thrown into it. I asked my aunt about it and she said she talked to the parents, but they kept throwing shit. So that night I go online and file a police report with their address. Couple days later the neighbors left a note at the front door with this long apology, it won't happen again, blah blah blah. It pretty much stopped after that. I put a spigot lock on our hose because she kept using my hose and flooding my flower bed in the process. The lady was pissed. Edited for clarification again, because some of y'all are coming for me, my boyfriend and I own our home trailer and we pay monthly lot rent for the land we live on. Our neighborhood is a hoa. I live in the United States on the East Coast in the South. It's really hard to watch people speculate on my living situation and why I don't have a water bill, lol. We are homeowners and our water bill is included in the monthly lot rent. We are not on well water. It's city water. The houses in my neighborhood are close enough for my neighbor to drag our hose to her yard. Upstairs neighbor was noisy late at night, like 2 AM. Music, loud footsteps. We had repeated conversations about it, but he blew us off, bought us earplugs, and told us to deal with it. Unfortunately for him, the breaker box for the building was in our unit. A few tests later, with his friendly roommates who hated him just as much, we zeroed in on the breaker to his room and an unoccupied area. Guess who had strange power issues at night when being disruptive? They would miraculously resolve at 7 AM. He wasn't the brightest bulb in the box and never did suspect us. The landlord was aware of his disruptiveness and he was already on thin ice. We let him know not to call the POC regarding his issues and he was on board. After assaulting one of his roommates over an unrelated incident, his ass was kicked to the street at the end of the lease. Didn't realize how loud our home improvement projects were. Our units share a wall, and my neighbor works from home. Neighbor blew her top because she didn't know when the noise would end. Apologized with a gift basket of fruit and chocolate. Now we get along great. The rich brats next door were always throwing loud drunken parties when mom and dad went out of town for a few days, which was often. One Sunday morning I went out to find the corner of our lot, which was a school bus stop, littered with used condoms that had been left in the street or thrown into the grass. That night around midnight I gloved up and collected a bunch of them, then snuck into the neighbor's yard and scattered them around the pool, the garage, and the back door, where mom was sure to see them when she came home. There were no more parties. I think I was the annoying neighbor this one time. I used to live in a townhome complex where the back porches were just slabs of concrete and there was a kind of field which joined all of them, which was little more than a drainage field. One night I had like 5-6 friends over and we were on the slab grilling some chicken wings and generally laughing and having a good time. Not too loud, no music, and we weren't trashed, but I imagine we were still audible to the other buildings. Woman from across the way starts hollering at us, being loud and threatening to call the cops. A few of my friends were like, duck that lady, but I decided to take a different route. I plated up about 8 wings with the scratch made buffalo sauce which I'd invited everyone over to enjoy. I walked the food over to the lady on a paper plate and apologized for disturbing her. She told me she overreacted and was sorry for yelling at us. I told her it was okay, but told her I was concerned she'd probably had a shit day to be yelling at strangers for a little noise at 7 PM on a Friday. She did have a shit day. I told her I was sorry and that we'd keep it at a reasonable level as a courtesy to her. A little while later she yelled back over that those were the best wings she'd ever had, and we gave a little cheer back to her. Never heard from her again. Hope her days are better now. My house is right on the corner of an area where the road turns into at. I had issues with people cutting the corner and driving through my yard. One day someone damn near hit my dog. I went and bought a boulder, probably 300 or 400 pounds, and put right on the corner. Come winter and we had a bad snowstorm. Someone was coming through in a lifted Dodge and hit the boulder going about 20 and totaled the truck. Since then though I've had zero issues with people. Neighbor had a bad habit of parking too many cars in our really small parking lot. There were only enough spots for 2 cars per apartment, 4 apartments total. They often had 3 to 5 cars parked. I always had to ask them to vacate our parking spots when we got home. Every day practically. The neighbor on the other side of me got their Pontiac stuck in the driveway because of the snow. They left it there overnight, and come the next morning everyone needs to leave for work and whatnot. It's right in the middle of the driveway. I'm being yelled at by Pontiac neighbor and too many cars neighbor. I guess they both expected me to fix the situation with my truck. I told me BF at the time we were not helping either of them. They both went to him and asked if my truck could be used to get the car out. My truck? No. I dug out enough of the snowbank to get out and let them deal with it. Both of the neighbors got in my face and were yelling before I even said no. So it was a definite no. I give 0 ducks if you're going to yell at me for an issue you created. 0 ducks. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing for more videos.